Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to talk about the 7th generation Ford Mustang. We know it's going to be a 7th generation Mustang, and in this video I'm going to see if we can sketch out a design proposal for what the 2024 Ford Mustang might look like. Now, as with the BMW i7 video, my previous video I had on the channel, I'm gonna base this design on the latest spy photos of the car and also on current Ford design trends, which I think is gonna have a major impact on the next generation Ford Mustang and what it's going to look like. More on that a little later in the video. But first of all, let's go through the generations here from the first, the 1965 Ford Mustang to the 2022 model and see what actually changed in the design and where the trend is actually going here looking back to the 60s. So let's start with the beautiful 1964 Ford Mustang. This was the birth of the Stang right here, and this to me is still one of the most beautiful Mustangs to this date. I think the 1967 Fastback is my absolute favorite Mustang of all time. Coupe and the convertible, of course, they look great as well. What I love about this is, I talked about this before in previous videos on the Mustang, is this part of the front fascia. It looks almost like a psychopath with these deep eye sockets, and then you have the eyeballs in there. It kind of looks a little confused, a little mentally deranged maybe, but it's super powerful and it doesn't really know what to do with that power. That's the face of the Mustang when I see it, specifically the 1960s Mustang. And then quickly, when we go into the next generation here, this is probably, in my opinion at least, the least desirable, the least attractive generation of the Mustang, because this is when the muscle car era came to an abrupt end in the early 70s. So this still had a big V8, but the power output was about 130 horsepower. So the horsepower race was completely gone. That brought down the power output of all cars, American cars in the 70s, including the V8 Mustang with 130 horsepower. Then we come in to the Fox Body Mustang. This is a really, really cool take on the Mustang for the 80s here. These can look really, really nice and stanced if you have the proper wheels and tire setup for the Fox Body Mustang. And it also came of course with a V8, and it had a manual as well. So it is a really cool car in my opinion. I really love the design. It's a pretty clean design with these boxy shapes that is typical of this time period, and it's almost more timeless than the 1970s Mustang up here. Moving further down to the 4th generation Mustang right here. Of course, there are going to be several variation within these generations. I'm just picking one specific model from each generation here, but they're all going to look a little bit different. Of course, you have the SVT Cobra, for example, in this generation that has more of an angular design in the front end headlights. But this, as you can see, now we're into the melted cheese era right here. This is typical melted cheese. Everything is a radius and everything is a curvature, rounded, no sharp corners or anything on this design, specifically for this entire era generation of cars. But it still looks pretty cool. Nothing really that I think is top 2, top 3 Mustangs of all time. I'm not a huge fan of this era because of the melted cheese design, and also the build quality of this time wasn't that great. But then something major happened right here in 2005-06, around that time, when Ford decided to go all the way back to the first generation 1960s Mustang and modernize it into this design right here. And I really, really love this design. I think this looks better. The late 2000s I think looks better than the 2010, 2012. I used to have a 2012 Mustang GT manual with the Coyote V8. I loved that car. It went great in a straight line, but as soon as you went over a corner and over any type of bump, you could feel the rear end jump to one side. It was kind of an interesting experience to drive that car in high-speed corners, but it was still a very fun car to drive. Traditional, typical American muscle car with the simple build of it, the simple design design, and now you have this mental look back here in this front end. And I really love how they took this design from the 60s and modernized it for the 2000s. Last but not least, we have today's generation. Now this is a pretty big jump from this design to this design. So what happened here? What did Ford change in the strategy to come up with this design? In my opinion, there's only one muscle car left out on the market, and that is the Dodge Challenger. Unfortunately, I think Mustang should have gone more in line with the muscle car philosophy, but instead what they did with the latest Mustang, this is not at all a bad looking design. I really like the graphics and the proportions, everything looks really cool, but is it a muscle car or is it now more of a performance sports car? Which might not be a bad idea, but in my opinion, if you think about the Mustang and the essence of what a Mustang is, to me it's gonna be a muscle car. It doesn't have to be good in the corners, and it doesn't have to look like a sports car with these very low front end here and very typical sports car front end that we have these days. It still looks good, as I said, but to me it just lost the muscle car-ness. And I made a redesign of this, what I think this could have looked like if we implemented more of these lines right here, this horizontal line, and lift the face up a little bit and have it be more at an angular front end. And I'm going to show that redesign right here so you can see what my idea of this current generation could look like if we implemented more of the muscle car philosophy into the design. But now let's continue here and let's have a look at the current spy, the latest spy photos of the Ford Mustang here, and let's see if we can take something out of these photos that we can use then in the rendering. So if we look at this, it's very well camouflaged, but this is in fact the production body underneath here for the first time on photo. Previously they've used the current generation Ford Mustang and just have the current generation shell, but underneath they have the new Mustang. But this is in fact the new body as well underneath this wrap. So what you can see here is that we have a bumper in the front end, and it looks like we have some sort of intake right here. I'm not sure if it stretches across the entire front end at the bottom, but you can clearly see that we have some sort of grille here, almost like the current Mustang right now, and then you have the headlights at the almost same position as what we have right now. So this is what I'm going to use in the redesign. When we look at the proportions, I can barely tell this apart from the current generation Mustang. It looks very similar with these proportions. Even the little upswing in the rear end looks pretty similar, and the angle at the back as well, with this bumper integrated right here, as you can see. So it's very looking at it from a side view, the proportions looks almost identical to the current generation Mustang, which I don't think really is a bad thing. But as I said, it looks more like a sports car these days than a muscle car. In the rear, there's really not much to say here about the rear end. It looks like it had some sort of backpack here. I think this is just to confuse the photographers to figure out what this little bump in the rear end is. But it looks like a typical Mustang. If we just remove all the wrap, I can see the Mustang underneath here just by looking at the proportions. But as I said, let's focus a little bit more on the front view. We have the air intake right here. We have a bumper here, and you can see that it goes in here. That means that we have a grille. I'm not sure where it starts and where it ends, but we can kind of almost see the outline of the grille right here, and of course the headlights hiding underneath on the sides as well. So let's continue in Photoshop, and let's start with the redesign here. Let me talk you through my idea of what I think this new design is going to look like and why I think that more importantly. So as you know, we live in the times where we have an electric Mustang. So we have a full EV with the nameplate Mustang on it, Mustang Mach-E, and it's nothing wrong with that. That is pretty much 80% marketing by putting the Mustang name on an EV. Other than that, it doesn't have much in relation to what a Mustang has been up until that point and going back in history. So what I think Ford will do with the 7th generation Mustang here is, I think since the Mustang Mach-E is sold around the world, I think they're going to hammer in even more a lesser muscle car design in the front end, which is unfortunate, but I think that's what's going to happen. So it's going to be an even more dialed back design and not so super aggressive in the front end, more in line with what we see in the Mustang Mach-E. And I think they're going to just basically take the graphics of the Mustang Mach-E and implement it in the front end of the proportions of a Ford Mustang. That means that the grille is going to stretch a little longer, be a little shorter in height, and then we're going to have an air intake that stretches from one corner of the lower part of the front end all the way to the other with some details inside of it. And I'm going to try to visualize that, what I think it's going to look like here. That is pure speculation, but based on the spy photos that we saw, it looks like it has a pretty large intake on the lower part of each corner of the car in the bumper, and it also looks like it has a properly defined front bumper, which I think is great. Looking at the grille of the Ford Mustang Mach-E, I think it's going to have a similar outline to that, but it's going to be less stylized. Specifically, if you look at the bottom part of the Mach-E, it has some interesting curvatures in the surfacing of the grille, and I think the Mustang Mach-E, the regular Ford Mustang, is going to be a little bit more defined than that and less stylized than that. At least I hope so. We can have a little bit back of what the muscle car used to be, and that means less styling and more horizontal line in the front end. But at the same time, looking at the spy photos from a side view, you can see, I think it looks like the front end actually sits even lower than what it does in the current Mustang. And the reason for that is, again, I think this is going to be sold globally, and that means that it's going to have to attract a global audience. And muscle cars generally is not really the way to go if you want to sell cars globally. Unfortunately, I think they look fantastic. I think the Challenger design has been around since 2008 with very simple upgrades to the lights, the front and the tail lights, but it's basically the exact same car, and it's still selling like crazy. And that means that people love this design, this old school traditional muscle car design in the new form that the Challenger is. But as I said, Mustang and Camaro as well, I think they've gone more towards the sports car route, which it's not a bad thing in itself, but it means that the Challenger, in my opinion, is the only muscle car left on the market. And the next generation Ford Mustang, I think, is gonna be even more of a dialed down design and smoother design, more in line with the Mach-E and less in line with the 2007 Ford Mustang or 2006 that was based on the 1964 design. One thing I'm not a huge fan of when it comes to the Mach-E is the headlights themselves. I think the details, the LED bars in the headlights, they look too disconnected from each other, specifically these three light bars, and then you have the light bar on top. So what I want to do in this redesign is try to integrate them in each other better, so it looks like they actually belong to each other and are not separate LEDs. They're just randomly put inside of the housing of the headlights. I want to have it be a little more organic feeling in that specific detail, and that's also going to create a unique identity for the Ford Mustang. Looking at it at night and you only see the front headlights. I'm really looking forward to seeing what the new Mustang is actually going to look like, and this is a fun, I really like these videos when I do look at the spy photos and try to figure, and we together kind of try to figure out what the next generation will look like, not just based on the spy photos, but also based on, as I said, current trends within the specific company that we're focusing on. BMW, for example, very hard to see a trend or a red line in their design at the moment. They're all over the place with different kind of headlights and different kind of kidneys and different kind of proportions, and everything is different in the models that are designed at the same time. But I think Ford is a little easier to predict what they're gonna go with, and as I said, this is my idea of what next Ford Mustang will look like. I wish it would go back to a more muscle car feel, but unfortunately, thanks to globalization and sales across the entire world, I think they need to be able to dial it down to be able to sell it abroad as well.